Hey there, it's your new friend Zenrad. Hope you're doing well. There's a large catalog of weapons in Dark Souls 3, and there's one weapon class I largely avoid in FromSoft games, mainly because they're super bad. Assuming you know how to read and that you've done so with the title and thumbnail, I'll suspect you know where I'm going with this. Can you beat Dark Souls 3 with the worst weapon class in the game? It's whips, by the way. Although there's a small chance you don't know how to read, it's not a 0% chance. So just in case, can you beat Dark Souls 3 with only whips? Let's find out. Alright, it's time to meet our hero, Mr. Willy Whippet. He looks like this. And he's a knight. I thought this run through and realized I'm going to be hit a lot. So Willy needs to be beefy. He needs to be full of beef. Just a round sack of meat. In all of DS3, there are only 5 whips. The first of which you get in the Undead Settlement. So for this run, I dropped the first attainable whip. The whip. It's just called that. It's just a whip. And god damn it, I can't wield it. We need the knight class though. I need to be beefy. We're just gonna have to deal with this amount of damage for a little while. Alright, I'm going to sprinkle in different points of commentary while the run continues. Starting with the first reason why whips suck. They don't have a drop-down attack. Like, I get it, but also, why doesn't it just use your fist and deal slightly more damage than an unarmed fist would? Like, you give us something. Alright, Gundyr isn't hard, but with all my thinking through the build and not being able to wield the whip, I deal a solid 7 damage. But that's not an issue, because I can just parry and... Oh yeah, the second reason whips suck. They don't have a riposte or a backstab. And now this one I get because it's literally a whip, but again, why not just use your fist and give us like a little more damage than an unarmed would? You know? Like, something. So anyway, for Gundyr, I just parried and riposte until he was... Oh yeah, I can't parry him in his goopy form. Okay, well, I mean, the logical thing to do is to blow up Willy Whippet, create a new life form with the exact same stats, but this time, we start with black fire bombs. This will drastically speed up the killing of the goopy phase. Welcome to life, Willy Whippet 2.
It's time for murder.
While we kick his ass, I figured we could learn a little bit about him. First off, the version that we are fighting of Gundyr is actually an indestructible golem created from being pierced with a coiled sword. The original Gundyr, Champion Gundyr, was charged with the duty of linking the first flame, but was tricked and condemned to eternal service from the beginning. It's said that he was restrained at one point by a chain that had blocked his original path to the Firekeeper, resulting in him falling into the abyss and being lost to the folds of time. Gundyr found himself in a moment of time when the Firelink Shrine had no fire, and ended up arriving late, never meeting his Firekeeper. It's also said that the dark pus that manifests in his last battle is the condensed, untamed fury of his humanity. It's crazy how linked the game and the lore is, even though they don't tell you anything. One of the items you receive from transposing Champion Gundyr's soul is a broken prisoner's chain. And on top of that, even the boss arena for Golem Gundyr has lore-related reasons why it exists. After becoming a golem, his job was to act as a ritual test for those who would attempt to link the first flame after him. Over time, a literal arena with stands included was built around his remains. That's crazy, dude. Anyway, he's dead now. With the money paid out through Gundyr's death, we were able to level up our dexterity so we can wield the whip. And of course, the very first thing we do is kill Vordt. I mean, it's Vordt. He's literally always easy. One thing worth mentioning though is that Vordt has a programmed critical that deals a ton of damage, but the whip is ass and can't capitalize on it because of course it can't. So we just beat his ass instead. Sorry, no lore in this one. The fight was just not long enough. Vordt is just too easy. Look at these ugly bastards. I didn't look too hard, but I couldn't find any lore on them. If you want to try looking it up yourself, though, they are called Batwing Daemons. At this point, in a normal playthrough, you would get the first whip. There's not much really to say about it, except for how useless it is. Even the actual description reads, a leather whip that was never intended for combat, of little use against armor and tough scales. Yeah, this thing sucks. On top of that, you can't even power stance them. So having more than one whip is literally useless. Now, to be fair, you can't power stance anything in Dark Souls 3, but the lack of that mechanic affects whips way more than other weapon types, because the whip can't backstab, riposte, drop down attack, or parry like pretty much all other weapon classes can. Did I mention that the whip sucks? For this run, we definitely need Sig to help us fight Yhorm. It's very possible to beat Yhorm with literally any melee weapon, but the lack of being able to riposte when you make Yhorm kneel has me thinking the fight would take forever. Or so I thought. But you don't get to see that yet. And don't skip ahead. I need that watch time. I feel like this is an appropriate time to mention one good thing about the whip. Its range. It is nice being able to lock off of a target and just kind of throw out a big hitbox. It doesn't do a whole lot, but it does have its openings. Lore-wise, I couldn't find much on basic fire demons, but here's a little tidbit related to all demons. All demons are created from the Chaos Flame, which in Dark Souls 3 has already been extinguished. So there's literally no way of creating more of them. They're quite literally going extinct. So I killed one for some rings. Hey, don't blame me, okay? It's not my fault. I didn't know until editing that they were endangered, okay? Plus, I was immediately punished because now I have to deal with this stinkhole. Honestly, I rushed through this area though. I know where the 3 pillars are located, so I just immediately go to them and make my way to the perimeter bonfire. Now, for the Abyss Watchers, I assumed I was gonna have trouble with them because I can't backstab. So I grinded out some levels first before attempting the fight. And as it turns out, I was dead wrong. This fight was actually very easy. Most of the time, it's very easy. But I really thought this was going to be difficult because I usually just backstab them until I win. The whip just does good here. The Abyss Watchers are an interesting part of the Undead Legion of Farron. These individuals were formed to fight the threat of the Abyss, but what I found most interesting is that they all share the soul of Artorias. Because the Abyss Watchers wanted the strength of Artorias, they all partook in Wolf's Blood, which is the linking mechanism for their souls. I thought this was the most interesting thing about them because they all together add up to Artorias. Before making this video, I just thought that they were kind of similar and maybe took his techniques or something like that. I had no idea that they were literally him. Also, if you're wondering why you get a helper in the boss fight, I'll tell you, because there is an actual reason. Again, FromSoft is tying together game mechanics and lore without telling us. As an Abyss Watcher, you are constantly exposed to the Abyss, which turns out to be bad. It slowly alters you until eventually you become an unknown creature. So the other foot soldiers, known as the followers of Farron, would group up, single out the one who was altered too much, then stab and burn them. For the sake of honor and dying a good death, they would finish them off by throwing a spear into them. After linking the first flame, the Abyss Watchers were out of the job, and there wasn't anything left for the followers to do. So they wandered until Hollowing, ending up in the painted world of Ariandel. This is why we find a large number of enemies with throwing spears, flame breath skills, and swords in the beginning of the DLC. This kind of causes a huge issue though, because the Abyss Watchers were still abyssing, which means they were still slowly being corrupted by the Abyss, with no one there to execute them before becoming fully corrupted. And that's why, when we arrive, they are endlessly killing each other in a world where they failed their mission. That's why you get a little helper buddy dude, because they're literally just corrupted and I don't know, hate each other. I know I don't know much about the lore of this game, but you might. And I'm getting all this information from the Dark Souls fandom page, which does come with some interpretations on my end. So if you notice I make a mistake, I welcome the corrections in the comments. But only if you do it with an Irish accent. While past Senrab finishes whipping the Degenerates, the current to me but still past Senrab to you will talk about today's sponsor. Yeah, I'm just kidding, I don't have a sponsor. I just wanted to say that. Realistically, I'll probably never have a sponsor. I don't even have ad revenue yet, so that's kind of a pipe dream at this point. But that's okay, because I do this for the fun of it. And now I've killed enough time, hopefully, for the next segment to start. Hi, Lord Wolnir, everyone's favorite boss. Wolnir's past is more interesting than the reason he's here in the Abyssal Dark Realm shoreline. The Abyssal outbreak just happened in the catacombs, where he was, and he just literally fell into it. And that's why he's here. Sucks to suck, I guess. The real question is, did he deserve to fall into an eternal, maddening abyss? Yes. Yes, he did. Wolnir was a giant humanoid that rose to power in the Carthus of Sands, a desert kingdom where pyromancies developed their knowledge in isolation. This led to the warriors developing incredible sword techniques, where they were able to move as weightless as a grain of sand. Very dramatic. All of these warriors unfortunately swore blind loyalty to Wolnir, dedicating their entire lives to him, and growing ruthless and bloody in his name. Under Wolnir's rule, the Kingdom of Karthus became an aggressive and expansionist one. Wolnir subjugated all nearby kingdoms, melding the various crowns that ruled the lands into one, thus ascending to High Lord Wolnir. At some point, Wolnir stripped 3 armlets and a holy sword from the corpses of some clerics to demonstrate how religion and gods counted for nothing in his kingdom. He was a real swell guy, as you can tell. On top of that, he was so smart that just because he felt it to be, he decided that he must outlive every other being in the world. So he sentenced his entire empire to death, slaughtering civilians and soldiers alike. Following the massacre, the catacombs of Karthus were built as an immense underground necropolis that was to entomb the bones of countless people and soldiers. High Lord Wolnir then used necromancy to reanimate himself and control a skeleton army and empire. Following that, the outbreak of the Abyss consumed the catacombs, and he tripped and fell into the Abyss. Okay, I may be ad-libbing that last part, but seriously, it just says that he, fell into the Abyss when the outbreak happened, so that's all I got for you. Anyway, he experienced the terror of true darkness, making him plead to the gods for the very first time. While only left with his sword and 3 sacred armlets, giving him comfort and preventing him from being swallowed by the Abyss, we show up and just kind of ruin everything for him. We send him into eternal terror, brought to you by the Abyss. Cool story, much deserved. That brings us to the Crystal Sage. Honestly, there isn't much lore on them. It's just some filler stuff, and I hate fighting them. So for personal reasons, I'm going to be petty and deny them the lore spotlight. With the whips only, it wasn't a struggle. Just make sure to clear a few out each round on the second phase. No weapon will save you from a bombardment of crystal blasts. Die. Die and never return again. And we finally made it far enough in the game where we get our second whip. This is huge, because it's a whip. And it also bleeds. Okay, so it's not that good. But it is different, and who am I kidding? The whip weapon class sucks. There's literally no variety. This is literally the same thing I've been using, but it does slightly less base damage and afflicts bleed sometimes. The skill is even the same. In fact, the only whip that has a unique skill that's useful in this run is the Witch's Locks. But don't get too excited. It's also literally the same animation as the other whips, but it has some flames on it instead. On our way to slave trade the Deacons, we have to stop by Patches and give him the old 1-2 whipped kiss the shoe. Patches doesn't have much lore, but his very existence in all the Souls games does mean he is either a trans-dimensional being or every iteration of time has a Patches. Either way, he's kind of annoying to kill with the whip. Now, this is what the whip was meant for. Crowd control. This fight and this fight alone were made for this weapon. Not because it makes fighting the Deacons any easier, though. This is just an easy fight. Whips suck. The Deacons, however, also kind of suck, lore-wise. Most of their lore is actually about Aldrich. Basically, there were 3 archdeacons that formed a cult around the powerful, human-eating Aldrich, who eventually, through eating the undead, became powerful enough to link the First Flame and become a lord. Just to clarify, that means the area, the undead settlement, is actually just an accumulation of undead food that goes through the road to sacrifices, being prepared for consumption by the Deacons for Aldrich. That's friggin' crazy, dude. 2 whole areas that you need to explore in Dark Souls 3 are just meant to farm food for a goopy, hungry slugman. Okay, so the main feature of this run is the whips, but I think it makes sense for me to update you on my level and what I'm doing. But the whip is so basic that I'm literally just speccing levels into dexterity. Later, I'll spec into intelligence because the Witch's Whip has the highest damage and that scales with intelligence. But for now, this is all I'm doing. And as far as rings go, the only important one is Pontiff's right eye, which I'm so conveniently getting right now. After stopping by our napping friend Sigurd in the dangerous cells of... Sig? Oh fuck, I forgot to give him his clothes. Thankfully, he was still trapped in the well. So after stopping by our sleepy friend, I whipped my way to Pontiff. This was the first boss in the run to really challenge the whip. Pontiff is normally easily parried and dealt with by any weapon that can land a few hits on him here and there after a few parries. However, the whip can't riposte, because it sucks. So instead, I was left with learning the boss fight, utilizing the reach the whip has in very few windows. Pontiff is an aggressive boss, and that's the best counter to the whip. I don't stagger Pontiff with any melee attacks, so I need an opportunity with a long enough window to whip and roll. And after a while, I noticed I can slip by his right side a lot, which allowed me to land attacks. There is so much lore with Pontiff Sulyvahn. So much so that it starts off with him as a child, born and isolated in the Painted World. To sum it up very briefly, Sulyvahn was a genius sorcerer who rose to power after leaving the Painted World, one of which was the Profaned Flame, which is an unfading, everlasting flame. With great foresight and the limitless flame, Sulyvahn rose to power, enthralling the city's holy knights, which in turn also expanded his influence to those who were commanded by the knights. They effectively became his personal militia. Several other events took place, such as enslaving the giants, because of course, that worked in the city, and erecting a special barrier that wouldn't allow anyone to enter or leave without his direct approval. This is why we have to beat the Deacons of the Deep to obtain a special doll item before entering Irithyll. Okay, so there's like a ton more Pontiff Sulyvahn lore. This man was busy. There's so much more lore that I won't be able to get to all of it. This is, after all, a whip-only DS3 run. I'm not the lore guy, but I do hope to aid in the interest of the FromSoft universe. I do want to apologize for anyone who maybe thought that this video would be like the most in-depth lore thing. I don't know why you'd think that, but there's probably somebody out there that did for some reason. So I'll be stopping here, but I highly recommend reading the lore article on Pontiff Sulyvahn using the link I'll leave in the description or pin in the comments. This is probably going to happen a few times in the video, but I promise I'll sum up all the best parts, or at least all the key points. And you know what? If I leave you wanting more lore, I think I've done my job. And don't worry, if you were here for the Pontiff lore, he comes up a few times later in the video. Like I said, this man was busy. So of course, there's several references to him in other bosses, such as the Dancer, who was a direct descendant of Gundyr, Princess of Sunlight, a hybrid between the race of gods of Anarlanda and humans who inhabited the Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. After Sulyvahn imprisoned Dark Sun Gwyndolin, proclaiming himself Pontiff and assumed control of the city, he just decided he was a Pontiff and no one could stop him. He bestowed a set of paired enchanted swords to the Dancer, but this served only as a symbol of her new subjugation to the tyrant, as they were enchanted with dark magic in the right hand and fire in the left, mirroring those of the Pontiff. Then he ordered her to serve as a dancer in his service. Now this doesn't sound that bad, considering he then ordered the Dancer to serve as a Boreal Outrider Knight, which was the same as being exiled. You'd think that this would be great for the Dancer, since she was effectively told to just go away. But before doing so, she was given one of the Eye Rings of Pontiff. This ring transformed them into savage, raving warriors who only knew how to serve as a mindless guard. If you noticed in that last sentence, I said them. The other unfortunate soul was Vordt of the Boreal Valley. I skipped his lore segment earlier in the video because the fight was short, but his story is the same as the Dancer's. Born of the same blood, forced to a position and transformed into a mindless guard for Pontiff's benefit. Only his role was to keep a watchful eye on the Dancer. And if you've been keeping a watchful eye on the gameplay, you would have noticed that the whip does okay against the Dancer. The way I fight the Dancer is usually sticking close to her right heel, and that strat doesn't really change with the whip. Don't get me wrong, the whip isn't a good choice against the Dancer. It's just a choice. That doesn't make it any harder than it is. It still sucks. Mainly because the R1 is slow, so I usually have to tank a hit unless I wait for the few really big openings. It causes the fight to be longer than normal, which can pose some issues if you get greedy, but for the most part, it's the same. Shit. This fight's lasting longer than I have script. I thought I'd have the opposite problem with the lore articles being so damn long. Editing me, quick! Turn up the game audio so the viewer can be serenaded by the sick boss music. So at this point in the run, I decided it was time to give myself a new whip. Usually you get the Witch's Locks in the Grand Archives, but because the whip lacks so much variety, and the Witch's Locks is the only whip with a different skill, I decided to drop it for myself now. I also gave myself the Spotted Whip because, well, poison is literally useless in this game. There isn't a single boss moving forward where it's more beneficial to have a poison whip. And it actually doesn't matter because I literally don't use it moving forward. Seriously, I don't know why the whips are even in this game. Would they have been broken if made useful at all? I mean, like, there has to be some happy medium where they could actually be used as, like, a main weapon. Anyway, here's the weapon skill I've been waiting all playthrough to see. Yeah, I was very disappointed when I saw that it was literally the same skill, but had some flames on it. I think this video's made my point about the Whips being the worst weapon class in the game. Moving on, we stopped by Sigward's apartment to say hi, and made our way to Yhorm, where we find out that Sig is that guy and is actually the main character. So there are two reasons why I continue to use Sig in my playthroughs while only using specific weapon types. One is because it's the earliest way to get a Titanite slab, and two is because with his help, this fight is significantly shorter. Yhorm isn't hard. Even if you use only a melee weapon and disregard the Storm Ruler, it's easy if you know how to do it. I was going to demonstrate this during this run, but remember that the whip doesn't have a fast attack rate, and I have to free aim the R1s on Yhorm's weak spots. This made getting Yhorm to bow his head for a critical strike, which the whip cannot perform by the way, because of course it can't, take forever. So Sig does do most of the damage here, but I still only use the whip, and the fight doesn't last 10 minutes. Everybody's happy. Right? Of course you are. You're a reasonable guy, I would assume. Aside from making the riposte impossible, the whip isn't a bad choice for this fight, because Yhorm is so large. Hitting his head when he bows is pretty easy, although you don't get many shots at it, and when you free aim the R1 correctly, hitting the weak spots isn't the worst. Again, this is not to say the whip is a preferred weapon by any means, it's just a weapon. Anyway, Yhorm's lore is short, sweet, and sad. He is, of course, a giant, also descendant of a great conqueror, who was asked to lead the people serving as their blade and shield. To gain their trust, he gave the people a giant-slaying sword and risked everything for his people on the front lines, fighting as a one-man vanguard. But at some point, someone dear to him was lost, and he foregoed his shield and notched his sword so that he could use two hands. The notes say that this made him more ferocious in battle. At some point, some historical event created the profane flame, and due to Yhorm's position, he was tasked with snuffing out the endless flame. However, the flame fell from the sky, annihilating all of the city. But for some unknown reason, this hellish flame only burned human flesh. The flame, despite being derived from the dark abyss, actively sought to harm humanity. Before burning the first flame, Yhorm gave his other Storm Ruler to his one and only friend, Sigward, who promised to end Yhorm's suffering if he ever returned to life. This is what makes Sig the real main character. Aldrich. I remember when I first entered your mucky, sludge-filled prison room. Seeing the name Devourer of Gods come up over the boss health bar really added a lot to this boss encounter for me personally. When I first fought Aldrich, I thought I would need every possible ounce of skill and all the levels I could get to beat him. Turns out I was just dead wrong though. Aldrich is one of the easier bosses of this game. He's got some BS with the arrows if you aren't ready for them. They deal a stupid amount of damage, but aside from that, all he does is shoot a couple of beams, send out some magic firefly thingies, and occasionally swings his scythe polearm thing. To avoid the arrows, you can either run up to him fast enough as he spawns so he doesn't launch the arrows at all, or you can simply run to the side. This fight can be annoying because of how much time you have to spend not fighting him when running, but it's not hard. When he's stationary, he telegraphs his moves pretty well, and it's not hard to avoid them. So just like Yhorm and some bosses before him, using the whip here wasn't a terrible experience. But I'm sure you remember, because I've said it every time, and I'm not letting you not hear it now, the whip is not a good option. It is just an option. It's just a weapon. It deals damage. It's better than punching him to death. Also, Aldrich is getting the Pontiff treatment here. There is so much lore with him, and of course it relates to Pontiff because all these areas are linked, and again, Pontiff was busy. The biggest thing to take from reading up on Aldrich is he is one of the descendants of the gods who resided in Irithyll, just like the Dancer and Vordt. But despite his role as a man of faith serving the gods, he was actually a sickly, depraved being who took pleasure in devouring humans and hearing their last screams. He, in fact, ate so many people for so long that his own body bloated, becoming what we see him right now. There wasn't a magical ring that transfigured his body or anything like that. He wasn't tricked into anything. This guy just ate people until he turned into a slug. And the reason he was able to get away with eating so many people while being of the faith and working in the church was because during this time Pontiff was rising in power and ended up imprisoning Allfather Gwyndolin, fully corrupting the church. Even Pontiff at some point had the realization that Aldrich would eventually pose a threat to the city because he's eating so many people, that he imprisoned him inside the Cathedral of the Deep. Now, I'm going to cut the lore short, as I mentioned previously, but I wanted to leave you with this. Aldrich continued to gorge on humans and inevitably achieved an immense level of power and the qualifications to become a champion to link the flame without any consideration for his morality or how he acquired the strength. He was also allowed to continue his vices, aka eating people, because linking the flame was just an important job. This guy is the literal definition of gluttony going unpunished. Whipping forward to the Dragonslayer Armor, unfortunately, the lore surrounding this boss is quite short, and the fight against the armor was quite long due to the slow nature of the whip. On top of that, this is the second boss that really challenged the whip. I really had to learn all the moves of the Dragonslayer Armor to keep up with the whip here. Even with buffs, for how little attacking I get to do in fights, I was not doing enough damage. Even with my thick beef, I was still being killed by only a few swings. Eventually I got lucky and dodged the more important moves while just barely doing enough damage to close out the fight. This fight took me the longest at about 30 minutes to complete, and there were no tricks. I didn't find a single new thing out about this boss. I simply reacted to his moves and whipped him to death. Kind of. He's not actually a person, or he's not actually a living being. The boss name doesn't lie. It is in fact just a set of armor. I, however, did lie a little bit earlier. The lore is long here. It's just not really about the boss's existence. It's about Lothric's past and the natural progression of armor going through one kind of threat to another. In the old days, when dragons and wyverns were the main enemies of Lothric, knights had to be insanely strong, and armor needed the qualities to withstand the heat from dragons and the lightning from wyverns. Wyverns? I don't know. You can yell at me in the comments. Eventually, Lothric domesticated wyverns, and the threats changed from the flying beasts to more humanoid creatures, so the armor changed with time as well, becoming smaller and closer to what we see today. Now, as for why there isn't any fleshy bits inside this beefcake set of armor, that would be because of the pilgrim butterflies you see flying around the castle. The same ones that send hailstorms of dark magic and shoot laser beams at you during the fight. Little is known about these flesh and bone creatures, but using the power of dark magic, they possessed an ancient set of armor that was just lying around. This truly is just a set of armor, and it's becoming more hilarious to me that this was one of the hardest bosses for this run. Actually, it's just the hardest boss for me in general. This is just one of the harder bosses. It's not even some guy. It's just a bug. Okay, we're nearing the final stretch. The run is almost complete, and I'm so close to being able to see the sun for the first time in weeks. All that's left to do is beat 2 bosses and learn all of their reasons for existence. There's only 2 issues with that. 1, the whip, for some reason, most of the time doesn't hit Prince Lothric, even though I'm standing behind both of them swinging directly at him. And 2, the lore is long here, and I'm growing tired. I'll start with issue number 1. Fuck the whip, this shit sucks. I beat his ass by reacting and whipping. I literally didn't learn anything else about him. My tactics are the same. You just whip and roll. Whip and roll. Whip and roll. 2. The princes are the child of Osiris the Consumed King and Guinevere. Yeah, explain how that one worked. Anyway, although born sickly, never growing out of his baby clothes, Lothric was the destined hope of the king to become the champion to link the flames. Osiris leaked propaganda well before Lothric was ready for his duties in hopes that he would grow out of his sickly state and become strong. Obviously that didn't work. They even went as far as melding together the souls of the brothers Lothric and Lorien to become one so that he may acquire the strength to become a champion. Lorien was the opposite of his brother. He was well accomplished, leading the war against the Chaos Demons and single-handedly defeating the Demon Prince. So Lothric willingly partook in the soul merging even though it was done so with a curse. Eventually the Consumed King, driven by madness, trying to turn himself into a dragon, abandoned the government. And we're left with this fight. Just, the brothers hanging out, waiting for that fire to fade. The lore is much more detailed if you want to check it out yourself. If these 2 interest you, it's definitely worth a read. However, I don't recommend using a whip against them. It's quite maddening. I did not have a fun time in this fight, and usually I do. Usually I like this fight. The whip made this a terrible experience. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. Let's finish this video. Cue the music. The soul of Cinder is a piece of shit. This was by far the worst fight with the whip. It took me a grand total of 35 minutes to beat, which honestly isn't that long, but goddamn did I hate fighting this husk with the whips. It's just a bad weapon. Final thoughts are that they are bad and have almost no redeeming qualities at all. There isn't any specific BS I dealt with in this fight. The fight is just hard with only a whip. Also, something that's personally annoying for me who's creating this video is his lore has the shortest amount of information, and his fight, as in the time I had to spend whipping and rolling, is the longest. This fight takes forever. This is another one of those fights where none of my original tactics changed when using this weapon. It's just learn the openings, whip, and roll. I'm going to end this video with his lore while fighting his second phase because the fight lasted so long I just don't have enough commentary to put here that I wouldn't consider fluff, and I like to keep my videos neat. So here it is. The Soul of Cinder is a godlike manifestation of all those who link themselves to the First Flame in history, thus making the Soul of Cinder an entity that possesses all the abilities of the previous champions despite just being an empty husk. Its only purpose is to be the last defense of the flame, acting as the ultimate test of strength. When tested by an aspiring champion, the Soul of Cinder would even bring out the remnants of the will and power of the first to ever link the First Flame, Lord Gwyn himself.